Welcome back to The Heat. Is there a power structure in place in Washington that operates like a shadow government, what some refer to as the deep state? Joining me now here in the studio is Frank H. Buckley. He is an author, media contributor, and professor at George Mason University Law School. He's the author of the book, The Way Back. And joining us from California is Eric Draitser. He is a geopolitical analyst, and he's the host of CounterPunch Radio. Welcome to both of you to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start out in California with Eric. And Eric, you just heard what Mike Lofgren had to say about the deep state. He's done a lot of work on this. He's worked at Congress. He's seen it firsthand. What did you make of what he said?
Well, I think there's a tremendous amount of truth in what Mike was saying, and I think that he's quite correct to point out that essentially the deep state should be understood as more or less an interlocking system wherein government agencies and apparatchiks within those government agencies and those in the private sector, those within the military-industrial complex and so forth, that essentially works towards a common agenda, a common set of goals, although it is not something that is necessarily conscious, and it's not something that is necessarily planned out in a monolithic sort of way. And I think that one of the points that was being stressed, and I think it's critical to note, is that the deep state does not act in concert. It's not a monolithic entity. It's not a undifferentiated cabal, but rather it is a series of factions, many of whom are at each other's throats right now. And I think that Trump has in many ways brought that into stark relief. And that's one of the most critical contributions to the discourse thus far, namely that the deep state is not one single entity, but that it is in many ways the manifestation or the architecture of the ruling establishment within the state apparatus.
Frank, what are your views? Well,
I think it's helpful to remind people that we're talking about not one single thing, but 27 different things. And the question is, do they add up to one single thing? And I think I'd say not. There are many different things going on, things we should like to correct, and things that are hard to correct. I mean, for starters, I think it's useful to distinguish between private groups out there that are trying to influence politics and then the regulators, the administrators in government. As for the private groups out there, look, I get emails every day from these guys. You know, as you noted, they're not trying to cover up. They're publicizing their stuff as best they can. There's nothing like even close to a conspiracy. Instead, you have different contested groups. I think it's more helpful to push them off the table and to talk about the bureaucrats in Washington, who are, I think, systematically in favor of government. Surprise. I mean, it's government that hires them, and therefore systematically opposed to administrations that want to shrink the size of the state, drain the swamp, as it were. And that really, that's something one lives with, basically. It ascends to a problem when you talk about people like General Flynn. That's a special kind of issue.
But is it necessary then for these groups to have relevance, to have a function, that this country be constantly in a state of tension with other countries around the world and to be at war with other countries around the world?
Well, that's a separate issue, and it's one where hopefully the present administration will roll back some of those efforts at war. I thought I hoped Trump was the peace candidate, I must say. We'll see how that turns out, but it certainly was the case that he didn't believe in foreign adventurism. His foreign policy speech was one which talked precisely about the opposite.
Eric, given what we know, are you in any way surprised that there isn't more outrage about what we're hearing right now? There isn't more calls for accountability on the part of the public, on the part of those people who vote these politicians into power?
Well, to some degree, I think there is, and I think that's manifested in some of the media coverage, in particular, some of the major corporate media outlets in the United States that have been giving some play to a lot of these issues. But I think that there's also another important facet to this, and it's, I guess, in response to the previous comments there, and namely that this separation between the private sector, the private institutions, and the government institutions, I think is, to some degree at least, artificial, because as we know, there is a revolving door between the U.S. government and the private sector, whether it's Wall Street and finance capital or military contractors, mercenary companies, or big oil, big agribusiness, or what have you. So a lot of what we are calling here the deep state is in many ways the fluctuation, the ebb and flow between these various facets of power in the United States. And in many ways, it is a somewhat permeable delineation between those two. And I think that that's part of what we're seeing here, because as Trump Trump is able to posture as a populist, an isolationist, an anti-interventionist, and so forth during the campaign, he's still very much embedded with private contractors, with those who benefit from military contracts. He's out there publicly today talking about raising the military budget some 10% or $54 billion. Many elements within the deep state are going to benefit significantly from many of the policies that Trump is putting forward. And that's why I would certainly reject the storyline or the narrative that somehow the deep state is at war with Trump. I think rather the Trump administration, this incoming administration or the administration we see now, is a battlefield within which the elements in the deep state are fighting it out.
What do you think, Frank? Is there, or at least is the president the target of the deep state?
The more I listen to this, the more I think the term "the deep state" should be banished from the language.
Right.
But I will say there are elements of a problem that need to be addressed. For example, one thing I think became clear in the last election round is money does not buy votes much in politics. I mean, Hillary outspent Trump 2 to 1. Much good it did her. On the other hand, when people talk about the influence of lobbyists in Washington, there I'm on their side. I mean, at this point, it looks as if Congress is something of a farm team for K Street. You leave Congress, and 50% of the ex-congressmen take a job as a lobbyist. That's how you get 1,000-page bills with 20,000 pages of regulation attached. We can't stop lobbyists from talking to congressmen. We don't want to, but we don't want or shouldn't want to see lobbyists contributing money to politicians.
There is one view that right after the election, I think we could say that there was a state of shock in the country when Donald Trump was elected, and straight after that, those forces that strongly supported Hillary Clinton and the others made a concerted effort to undermine the guy who was just won.
Yeah, and much of that is just what happens in a free society. I mean, I pick up the Washington Post every day, and there are 2 stories on the front page about how terrible he is in the Metro section, and the style section, and even the sports section, for gosh sakes. But that's fine. One has a free press, and they're able to do that. The greater concern, I suppose, is not merely bureaucrats who will oppose the Trump agenda, and one lives with that, but the extent to which one fears that improper uses are made of their knowledge to destabilize the presidency. And of that, I mean, I have problems with what happened to Mike Flynn, but apart from that, it's going to be a matter of some house cleaning by people like Rex Tillerson.
Right, Eric, that's a point. I mean, could we see this actually being counterproductive for what we might call the deep state? I mean, what if, as this administration beds down, as it finds its feet, it starts a major purge of these organizations and replaces all those people in upper management, middle management, with its own people?
Well, to some extent, that's politics.
I'll get to you in a moment. I just want to get that from Eric. It's fine. Go ahead, Eric.
Well, I do think that there is an element of that. That's part of what we've seen, certainly with some of the personnel changes in the State Department as one example, but in a number of other government agencies as well. So there is an element of that happening now. But of course, the danger is, well, really twofold. On the one hand, eliminating many of the operators and so, let's call them technicians of the bureaucracy of the U.S. government, thereby making it even more dysfunctional. And on the other hand, of course, creating such a furor within those institutions that it undermines and destabilizes the government itself. And so I think that Trump is really playing a rather dangerous game if he moves forward with a full purge. And I think that that's part of the reason why you're seeing Trump backing away from a lot of these positions and really becoming more amenable to the political, geopolitical, and strategic agenda of the U.S. government as it has been to this point.
Okay, Frank, you wanted to say?
Well, I think the main reason why he's not going to go through a major purge is because these people have tenure, and you can't just go around doing that. But in many cases, one would hope to see that there would be a change in the administration. Just trivial example, say the National Endowment for the Arts, for example. I mean, presumably the president would like to have his own team in there. This is why there are political appointees who will tell the bureaucrats, the permanent folks, what to do. Ditto in the State Department. That's really how it's supposed to run. I don't see a problem with that.
And this is not a new phenomenon, and we saw it during the Hoover era, didn't we?
Oh, J. Edgar Hoover.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Well, it's funny when you think about that. I mean, if there is such a thing as a bad old deep state, how would it misbehave? Well, in one case, it might be revealing information. In the other case, it might be not revealing information, right? And there seem to be a lot of cases of strategic non-disclosure involving, say, John Kennedy.
We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks to both of you for joining us.